Let's talk about cats and witches. I read 4 books to prepare for this event. Witches, written by Erica Jong. It's a very good resource. I found it riveting to read. And Witches, the absolutely true story of the tales of disaster in Salem, written by Rosalind Shanzer. Very good one. Just sticks to the Salem witch trials. In Defense of Witches, the legacy of the witch hunts and why women are still on trial, written by Monica Cholette. And then I read this one, Witchcraft in Russia and Ukraine, 1000 to 1900. Well, I have to admit, this was not that fun to read. I just found the writing a bit stilted because it's translated from Russian and Polish, so it just didn't flow like the other ones. But I made a copious amount of handwritten notes. So let's get started with this. So, cats and witches. Our stories have always been intertwined, like almost always been intertwined, right? I don't know if it's because of the way cats move, their graceful movements, the way they lick their paws, or the fact that they make you work for their attention. Women have always been associated with cats through centuries. I need to share my screen. We can get started. Yeah. Okay. So our modern notion of a god is almost always a white male, and the only traces of a feminine deity that remain are Mother Nature, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and then the Wicked Witch. But cats need no introduction. We worship them in ancient Egypt, and they have never forgotten about it. This is Bastet. She is one of 2 feline goddesses once worshipped in Egypt. She was a goddess of the home, of women's secrets, fertility, childbirth, and domesticity. No one in ancient Egypt dared to harm a cat or kill a cat because it meant an automatic death sentence for you. In the year 525 BC, during the Battle of Pelusium, the Egyptian army surrendered to the Persians because the Persians had cleverly painted Bastet and cats on their shields. The Persians also herded live cats ahead of them on the battlefield, and the Egyptians couldn't touch them because of that. So that's the extent of reverence for cats in ancient Egypt. This is Sekhmet, another lesser known feline goddess of war and healing. So cats were pampered, respected, and protected in Egypt, and also to a lesser extent in Rome and Greece. They are the favorite pets of royalty and of noble families. Even today, cats rule the internet. And I know that there's some of you out there who think that you own cats. I don't know how to tell you this. You are an employee. Dogs have owners and cats have staff. Nobody owns a cat. So this event is focused on a time in history when cats were chosen for a different type of special attention. So what was happening in Europe around this time? So there was a practice known as ailuromancy, which was practiced in most parts of Europe. And it was akin to reading tea leaves, only this involved predicting the future based on the movements of a cat's body. In Scotland, there was a ritual known as Tagum, which involved roasting a cat alive in order to summon a genie of some kind and get one's wishes granted. In the south of France, Cathars, also known as Albigensians, a religious esoteric sect which had flourished during the 12th century, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. And then an author named Walter Map dreamt up the story about Cathars worshipping cats. After all, you can't spell Cathar without cats, right? Jews who had been vilified as Christ killers were suspected of turning into cats and sneaking into Christian homes to get into all sorts of mischief. And so, for almost everything that the church disapproved of, there were cats involved. Then, in the year 1227, Pope Gregory IX was elevated to the papacy. There he is. At this time, the Inquisition had already begun. The previous Pope, Pope Innocent III, had already initiated inquisitions, starting with the Cathar Crusades in France that lasted over 20 years. But Pope Gregory formalized the Inquisition and transformed it into official church business. So Pope Innocent's top man and the first papal inquisitor was a man named Conrad von Marburg. He was a German priest and nobleman. Conrad had overseen the torture and burning of heretics. Now, to call Conrad sadistic would be an insult to sadists everywhere. And by the way, a lot of the trials happened in Germany. And so when I reference case histories later on, I'm not picking on Germany, there are just more of them. And so after carrying out a genocide in France under the old Pope, Conrad, who was reputed for his excessive cruelty, was made the chief inquisitor for Germany by Pope Gregory IX. Then in 1231, Gregory granted permission to Conrad to ignore standard church procedure in his investigation of heretics. And mind you, this is a man whose methods were so extreme that German bishops were already begging for his removal. And around this time, there were fears and rumors about satanic cults practicing actively and spreading their beliefs in Germany. And the church did not like competition. It didn't matter if you were heretic or you used to worship the old religions. If you were not Catholic, then you were a practitioner of evil and you worked for the devil. So in 1233, the Pope issued a papal bull called Vox in Rama that linked cats to Luciferianism. And he mentioned how black cats were used in satanic rituals. And there's a quote from it that says, "A black cat descends backwards with its tail erect. First, the novice, then the master, and then each one of the members of the order who are worthy and perfect kiss the cat on its buttocks," end quote. And then after this, there was a Sabbat, which was basically a wild sexual orgy. And then after the orgy, Satan appeared to his followers. It was most likely a confession that had been extracted from someone undergoing torture. In any case, legends and myths about cats being cruel creatures and allies of the devil and the familiars of witches began to spread. So a familiar was a pet that worked as an attendant and ran errands for the witch. They were partners in crime, right? And so the familiar could shapeshift and go into places on behalf of the witch and run errands for her. And so rumors spread about how witches could transform themselves into cats in order to scratch babies and do other mischievous things. The Pope declared that cats were demonic creatures, basically Satan in a fur coat. The demonization of cats went into full swing. They were hunted and killed. Many were burned together with their owners. Now, I want to share a video about black cats in particular and what they went through around this time.
Since the beginning of human history, cats and people have had a remarkable relationship. Cats hold different meaning and symbolism throughout many cultures and eras. Some societies even incorporated cats into their religious practices. The Egyptian warrior deity Bastet was a goddess who resembled a woman with a cat's head. She symbolized female sexuality, fertility, and motherhood. Ancient Egyptian households that included pet cats were blessed with good fortune by Bastet, and these pets were truly regarded as members of the family, often mummified and eventually buried alongside their loving owners once they passed on. Black cats in particular have had their own unique ties to human folklore. Good luck, bad luck, evil omen, a witch's familiar, a sailor's friend. Depending on who you ask, a black cat can signify a great deal. This is the haunting history of black cats. Egypt wasn't the only society in which black cats make an appearance. In Greek mythology, it is said that Hera changed one of her servants, Galinthias, into a black cat in order to punish her. In this new form, Galinthias began serving under a new mistress, Hecate. Hecate was the goddess of witchcraft and death, and is perhaps one of the earliest instances in human history of black cats being associated with witchcraft. In modern Western culture, particularly the United States, black cats are often seen as a sign of bad luck, but they are also embraced as a part of Halloween celebrations. The black cat often goes hand in hand with jack-o'-lanterns and ghosts as familiar symbols of Halloween. But how did black cats become a mysterious symbol of the occult? To find answers, we have to go way back before North America was colonized and take a look at Europe during the Middle Ages. After the demise of the Roman Empire, Europe, along with other nearby regions of the world, settled into the medieval period with a newfound devotion to monotheistic religions such as Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Christianity in particular became a large part of the lives of Europeans under the hardships of feudalism. But as religious devotion became more and more prominent in this arduous world, the late Middle Ages saw the view of witchcraft switch from benevolent practice to an anti-religion. Germanic and Norman societies saw black cats as unlucky and even a sign of impending doom. It wasn't long before black cats became associated with the devil and witchcraft, as fears of the supernatural intensified across Europe. Some folktales warn that black cats were used by witches to carry out evil deeds, and even to communicate with Satan. Some believe that witches could shapeshift into the form of a black cat in order to hide their identities up to 9 times, which is where the idea of a cat's 9 lives originates. A story from the mid-1500s in Lincolnshire, England, tells of a father and son encountering a black cat while out hunting for witches. They pelted the cat with rocks before it managed to take refuge inside a house belonging to an old woman. The next day, the old woman was seen limping and covered in bruises. This tale reinforced the belief that black cats were actually shape-shifting witches. The stigmatization of black cats led to people going out of their way to kill them in large numbers. Some researchers believe that the resulting decline in the cat population led to a rise in the rodent population, which accelerated the spread of the deadly bubonic plague. The superstition and lore surrounding black cats was carried over by pilgrims as they colonized North America, and it was especially prominent during the era of the Salem witch trials. While these beliefs have mostly faded with time, the negative connotations surrounding black cats are in some cases still lingering. According to a 2019 study, black cats spend on average 2 to 6 days longer waiting in shelters to be adopted than other cats. Halloween can be a dangerous time for black cats, as they can be used in pranks or adopted by people who use them as a Halloween trinket, with no intention of giving them a permanent home. Some black cats are even tortured and killed in animal sacrifices that take place more frequently around this time. Because of this, shelters will often pause black cat adoptions during the month of October. Despite these beliefs, not all of the West shared the same ideas when it came to black cats. For example, in Irish folklore, a fairy called the Cat-She was said to take the form of a black cat. This fairy spirit wasn't outright evil. In fact, it might bless your household or protect a farm's harvest of crops as long as you kept it happy and offered up a saucer of milk. But Cat-She was not one to be trifled with, and it could take away good fortune just as easily as it gave it. In one story, a man tried to poison Cat-She to prove that it was just a superstition. All of his neighbors put out a dish of milk for Cat-She, and he never did. But on this particular night, he would put out a dish laced with poison. At nightfall, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a black cat with a white chest dying at his doorstep. He went to town to find the owner, but became sidetracked at the bar. After a few drinks, he relayed what happened to the other patrons. The patrons, along with another cat who lived in the pub, listened to his story. When he finished, the cat stood up and spoke in a human voice. "Well, that makes me the king of the cats." Before anyone had a chance to react, he attacked the man, running him out of town. In parts of Scotland, a Cat-She was also known to take the souls of the recently deceased before the gods, so activities like games and coffin guarding were employed to keep black cats distracted and at bay before burials. Catnip was sprinkled throughout the home to keep them inside before funerals. Other countries also welcome black cats as a bringer of good luck. In Japan, cats of all kinds can be considered a symbol of wealth and luck. But a black cat specifically offered protection from evil spirits, and women who kept black cats were said to have better luck finding suitors. In southern France, a black cat, or matego, brought good luck if it was well fed and treated affectionately. Black cats were distinctly significant to sailors and considered a necessary good luck charm for a successful voyage at sea. Not only did they catch and kill mice and protect important cargo, they also provided a lot of affection and companionship for sailors. Black cats deserve to be celebrated for their beautiful appearance and unique relationship with mankind. With an understanding of our shared history, we can dispel fear and superstition and further erode the stigma attached to black cats. After all, these miniature panthers have been a great ally and companion to human beings for thousands of years.
Okay, so cats had always been associated with women and femininity right from the time of Bastet in Egypt. But it was the same thing in Europe. There was the goddess Freya, the Norse goddess. And so the Norse perspective came from the feline fertility cult associated with the goddess Freya. Freya was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and gold. Amongst her worshippers, cats were the most powerful animals. They aided magical activities of the vulva. That's the name for a Norse sorceress. And Freya's chariots often depicted being drawn by cats. Kitties. Cats were used in rituals for protection, fertility, and also love spells and shape-shifting. In Scandinavian folklore, there had been accounts of spirits using cats as their vessels to walk through the world. So, with the Catholic Church in power, the status of women was tied to that of Eve in the Bible. Because in the Bible, Eve gave Adam the apple or whatever that fruit was that caused the fall of man and all the troubles that man has to face now. And before Eve, there was Pandora, who had opened the box that unleashed evil on the world. And Pandora was a woman as well. And so all women were already sinful by nature. And when the demonization of cats in Europe began, it was easy to tie it in with the demonization of women and labeling women as witches. Now let's dispel something. There's a difference between witchcraft, and Satanism. They're completely different. A Satanist is a renegade Christian, a rebel who chooses Satan over Jesus, good versus evil. Practitioners of witchcraft believe that good and evil are intertwined and indivisible. Their religion is an ancient European shamanistic nature religion. Satanists turn crosses upside down, hold black mass, spell names of deities backwards, and substitute colors white for black. Practitioners of witchcraft of Wicca are not interested in any of that. Their interest is in transcendence and in communion with nature. They are preoccupied with the feminine principle, which goes by many names: Mother Goddess, Queen of Heaven, Mother Nature, Ishtar, Persephone, Aphrodite, Inanna, or Mary. They reject the Abrahamic religions because of the centuries of cruelty to women and their insistence on the inferiority of women. Our notions about um, witches have been shaped by decades of Christian propaganda as well as children's fairy tales. Like for me, it was Hansel and Gretel or Snow White. And so our modern idea of the witch is very different from what it originally was. And we got these notions from the Abrahamic religions. Roughly 25,000 years ago, humans worshipped a plethora of autonomous and immanent goddesses. This was Inanna, who was worshipped in Sumer. In Egypt, they had Isis. The Assyrians worshipped Ishtar. The Phoenicians worshipped Astarte. And the West Africans worshipped Oshun. They had many names, and their archetype was Aphrodite or Venus, whom in ancient times was more than just goddess of love and beauty, but also a powerful creator of life and death. And these goddesses were worshipped alongside male gods because masculinity and femininity were both equal and intertwined. And one prominent male deity at this time was the horned god. He went by many names: Carneos, Carnena, Cernuno, Pashupati, Faunus, and Bran, amongst others. But then there was a turning point roughly 5,000 years ago when there was a shift towards patriarchy. And so these once revered goddesses were deposed and erased from history. And it was accomplished through violence. And also their statues were broken, their temples were desecrated. And then the horned god, who had been their equal, was turned into the devil. That's why depictions of Satan or the devil always have him with horns. So some of the old pagan religions ceased to exist completely, and new ones that were exclusively dominated by men sprang up. Amongst these was Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, which spread through most of Europe and at some point was the predominant religion in Europe. And naturally, many of their adherents were, the former pagans. But in many rural areas, people still held on to their old tradition and their old practices. Some of them incorporated their pagan practices into Christianity. For instance, Ostara of the Dawn, she was the Germanic goddess of spring. The pagan Anglo-Saxons held festivals in her honor, and her sacred animal was the bunny rabbit. And this celebration was later subsumed into the Paschal calendar for the Christian resurrection holiday we call Easter. It's actually derived from her name. And that's also the reason why we have Easter bunnies, which have nothing to do with Jesus. So the point is, even when Christianity became an established religion, the cults that had worshipped those ancient gods for centuries, they still persisted. Well, in many places, old and new gods were worshipped simultaneously. Many Christian priests had been initiates of the pagan mysteries. And by the way, I know that the word pagan has a negative connotation these days, but it actually comes from the Latin word paganos, which means villager or civilian. So in today's parlance, it would be something like a hillbilly or a hick, something like that. And also the word heathen, which means heath dweller, has zero to do with religion. Okay, so with Christianity becoming mainstream and the old horned god evolving into the devil and the old goddess became the Blessed Virgin Mary, who'd been stripped of her sexuality. So those who continued to worship the old gods became labeled as witches, and many of them were killed, their religion stamped out. And so much of our ideas about witches today come from the Christians who actually persecuted them because history is written by the victors. Magicians and sorcerers have always existed, always, every culture and in every time through our history. But only during one specific period in history where the powers of the church and state joined together to exterminate them and the people who believed in them. And this was between the 14th century and the 17th century. It's estimated that roughly between 500,000 to 9 million people were killed. We have no way of knowing the exact numbers, but we do know that at least 80 or 85% of them were women. You know, in one part of Germany in the year 1585, two villages had only one surviving female inhabitant each. And you know, some of these people were not even practitioners of the old religions. They could get targeted for any reason, but we'll, you know, look through a few specific case histories as we go along. So now to get into the witch trials, before we get into that, let's see a video about one of the earliest known and recorded instances of a witch hunt. And it didn't happen in Europe.
In the city of Alexandria in 415 CE, the bishop and the governor were in a fight. It started with a disagreement over the behavior of a militia of monks and ended with an accusation of witchcraft leveled against one of the most powerful figures in the city. Hypatia of Alexandria was a prominent mathematician, philosopher, and advisor to the city's leaders. In the centuries since she lived, the details of her life have been the subject of much dispute and have taken on an almost mythical status. But while none of Hypatia's own writings survive, her contemporaries and students' accounts of her work and life paint a picture of the qualities that made her renowned as a scholar, beloved as a teacher, and ultimately led to her downfall. Hypatia was born around 355 in Alexandria, then part of the Egyptian province of the Eastern Roman Empire, and an intellectual center. Her father, Theon, was an accomplished Greek mathematician and astronomer. Her mother is unknown. Hypatia was likely an only child, and Theon educated her himself. By adulthood, she had surpassed her father in both mathematics and philosophy, becoming the city's foremost scholar and taking over his position at the head of the Platonic school, similar to a modern university. She refined scientific instruments, wrote math textbooks, and developed a more efficient method of long division. But perhaps her most significant contributions to intellectual life in Alexandria came through her teaching. The philosophy Hypatia taught drew from the legacy of Plato and Aristotle, as well as the mystical philosopher Plotinus and the mathematician Pythagoras. The convergence of these influences merged to form a school called Neoplatonism. For the Neoplatonists, mathematics had a spiritual aspect, divided among the 4 branches of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These subjects were not studied merely for the sake of curiosity or practical utility, but because they authenticated the belief that numbers were the sacred language of the universe. In the repeated patterns of algebraic formulas and geometric shapes, the orbits of the planets, and the harmonious intervals of musical tones, the Neoplatonists saw a rational cosmic force at work. Students delved into this ordered mathematical world to achieve higher unity with this force, known as the One. While Hypatia was considered pagan, a term for traditional Roman belief before Christianity, she worshipped no particular deity or deities, and her ideas could be applied alongside multiple religious viewpoints. Jewish and Christian, as well as pagan students, traveled from the farthest reaches of the empire to study with her. The nonpartisan environment Hypatia fostered, where all students could feel comfortable, was especially remarkable given the religious and political turmoil that was fracturing the city of Alexandria at the time. Christianity had recently become the empire's state religion. The local Archbishop Cyril had steadily gained political power, commanding zealous militias of Christian monks to destroy pagan temples and harass the Jewish population. In doing so, he encroached on the secular authority of the Roman governor Orestes, himself a moderate Christian, leading to a bitter public feud between the two men. Because she was seen as a wise and impartial figure, Governor Orestes consulted Hypatia, who advised him to act with fairness and restraint. But when a group of Cyril's monks incited a riot, badly injuring Orestes in the process, he had their leader tortured to death. Cyril and his followers blamed Hypatia, accusing her of witchcraft to turn Orestes against Christianity. In March 415, as Hypatia was traveling through the city, the bishop's militia of monks dragged her from her carriage and brutally murdered and dismembered her. Hypatia's death was a turning point in the politics of Alexandria. In the wake of her murder, other philosophers in the Greek and Roman tradition fled, and the city's role as a center of learning declined. In a very real way, the spirit of inquisition, openness, and fairness she fostered died with her.
So, witch trials. What did a girl need to do to qualify? Anything. Or nothing, actually. During the burning times, every behavior and its opposite could cost you. You talk back to your neighbor, or you ignored your neighbor, either was a problem. If you always attended Mass on Sunday, it was suspicious. If you missed Mass regularly, well, that was suspicious too. You regularly met up with your friends, problem. You were a loner who was reserved, also a problem. A ship had trouble at sea, a windmill broke down, the neighbor's cow had a stillbirth, the child was born disabled, you were attractive, you were unattractive. It didn't have to make sense. So witch trials began in Switzerland, which was notorious for their torture methods, by the way, particularly in the cantons of Valais and Vaud. In Geneva, in the year 1515, the first 3 months, they had already burned 500 people. That was more than 5 people per day, every day for 3 months. And another place where trials were prevalent was in Germany. 22 villages in the region of Trier, in particular, were at the epicenter of witch trials. In France, sometimes entire families were wiped out, as witchcraft was thought to be hereditary. So healers who had cared for the sick and helped women give birth have been the most respected and prominent members of their communities. They were suddenly labeled as instruments of Satan, like Magdalene Demas of Cambresis, who was 77 years old in 1670, when she, along with her mother, her sister, her daughter, and her aunt were killed. And as if things weren't bad enough already, a sociopath, published a book that made things infinitely worse. We're talking, of course, about the Malleus Malificarum. So let's talk about the background of the author and why the book was so effective and so successful. It was written by a man named Heinrich Kramer. He was a sex-obsessed inquisitor and a member of the Dominican order, a Catholic priest sect. They're highly educated. And so Kramer had gone too far in one of his overly sexualized interrogations of a certain woman, so much so that the bishop intervened and the woman was acquitted. And Kramer was bitter about this. He had failed. And so he channeled his incel frustrations into writing his masterwork. He aimed to prove that witches were driven by lust and were vessels through which the devil was made flesh. It was a book of vengeance against women. That's what it was. And the reason it was so successful was because it appeared to have the backing of the Catholic Church, and the church did nothing to dispel this. Kramer included a papal bull in its pages. Now, a papal bull is similar to a royal proclamation. It is a document signed by the Pope, which states that a document is official church doctrine. It was known as the Summis Desiderantis, which means the witchcraft bull. It expanded on the power of the witches to create storms and hail and to cause infertility in humans and in animals. It also officially sanctioned Kramer to hunt down witches. So Kramer had obtained this papal bull 3 years before he actually wrote his book. He had visited the Vatican with a letter requesting the Pope's permission to officially hunt witches. And he also paid a hefty, let's call it a donation, to the Vatican to grease the wheels. And it worked. And so 3 years later, when he wrote his book, he put the papal bull front and center. It was the first page you saw. And so together with his writing, made a deadly combination. It was manipulation at its finest. So the Malleus Malificarum, a title which means the hammer of the witches. It's a very old book which was written entirely in Latin in 3 parts, 256 pages. And he published it in the year 1486. He'd written it together with a man named Jacob Sprenger, but apparently the guy later denounced it. So the Latin version is only available in a few select museums around the world now, so I obviously didn't read that. I did read through the English version, and let me tell you, I needed a shower after reading it. I strongly advise against reading the book. It's just sickening and just unbridled misogyny. That's what it is. And so the author stated that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is insatiable in women. Wherefore, for the sake of fulfilling their lust, they consort even with devils. The first section establishes that witches are real, and any opinion to the contrary is heresy, and that witches work hand in hand with the devil. He says, they also have sex with the devil. Women, note women, not witches, women are a foe to friendship, an unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted with fair colors. Marriage is a necessary torture. This man had a mother. His book goes on to discuss how women are inherently lustful creatures who participated in carnal abominations and are intellectually like children. Women are always jealous and envious of each other, as Martha was of Mary Magdalene. If they are that way with each other, imagine how awful they are to men. He goes on to explain how women get impregnated by and produce offspring for incubi and succubi. Witches sway the minds of men to love or to hate by a process of interior temptation. That is, they enter his dreams or his imagination and impress whatever they want on him. Bewitchments can castrate men, cause abortions, and then offer the dead babies to Satan, change men into beasts, take over the bodies of innocents, and cause men to lose their virility. Part 2 of the Malleus Malificarum deals with the methods and procedures that witches use for their initiation, their sabbats, their flying, their sacrifices, sacrilege, and more. And no one was immune from the power of the witch, except for three distinct categories of men. So, the first category of men are those who administer public justice against witches or prosecute them in any public official capacities. So, interrogators, priests, pastors, torturers, guards, judges, and executioners. And they were all men. The second category, men who performed any traditional Catholic rites, such as exorcism, aspersion of holy water, men who carried palm fronds on Palm Sunday, who carried holy candles or consecrated salt during Catholic church events and rites. And the third category were those who were blessed by holy angels because of the influence of the stars and a special grace from God. And then he goes on to describe in detail the spells that cause deadly diseases, the conjuring of natural disasters, how babies are kidnapped and sacrificed, possession, how witches injure cattle, cannibalism, and blood drinking, how witches make a formal pact with the devil. You get the picture. I wonder how much he knew so much about witches and what they did. It takes one to know one, doesn't it? Part 3 is where he really applied his talent, where he set out how trials were to be carried out by fit and proper judges. This is a snippet from the Malleus Malificarum, just to show you something ridiculous. She bewitched my cow and she bewitched my child. It's ridiculous. Okay, so he set out the number of witnesses and how to begin the process. So first, an accuser had to go before a judge and make an accusation of heresy. And the accuser had to offer to prove it and submit to the penalty of talion. That is, if they fail to prove their case, then basically talion meant an eye for an eye. And another method was to make an accusation, but without offering any proof, because that person just loved the Catholic Church so much. And then the third method was inquisition, where there was no accuser, but a general report that there might be witches in a particular town. And the third method was by far the most commonly used. The victims could be random. And so God help you if you had a mole on your body or freckles or any birthmarks. Of course, many times the victims were targeted and condemned even before the formal proceedings even began. Okay, so now let's examine some of the weird and wonderful ways that they tortured the accused women, the enhanced interrogations they used. So There was swimming. The hands were tied to the legs, and then the accused was thrown into the nearest body of water, basically naked. And the idea was that if they were innocent, they would sink. But if they were witches, the water will reject them and they would float. So if you drowned, you were innocent. But if you did not drown, you were a witch and had to be executed. Please make it make sense. That's another variation of how it was done. Do you want to guess how many women drowned? Then there was also the prayer test. At a time when books were not readily available to the great unwashed, the inquisitor would ask them to recite Bible verses without any mistakes. And even if they recited the Bible verses or said the prayers, the Lord's Prayer specifically, correctly, they were still killed. And there was a test, witches' marks. This is a PG picture of it. You were stripped down, completely naked, and then your body was examined, every inch of it, for any marks. If you had any birthmarks, any moles, tattoos, scars, wounds, then they meant that the devil gave them to you when you signed your witchy contract. And they were supposedly used to feed your familiar with blood. And by the way, majority of these women were also raped repeatedly whilst in custody. They were raped by the guards, torturers, court officials, and judges. It was terrible. So sometimes the marks were said to be invisible. And in cases where the marks were invisible, they had a solution. They had a witch pricker who would jab uh, the accused with a needle or a knife all over their bodies. So you have the pleasure of being jabbed with these implements all over your body. And if they found a spot that was stabbed but did not bleed, that was the proof of guilt. They neglected to disclose that sometimes they used knives with retractable blades. Next, they used strappado. It's also known as corda. How painful does that look? Your hands were tied behind your back and you were then suspended in the air, and you had weights, usually bricks, tied to your feet to pull you down. And then, as if that didn't hurt enough, you were repeatedly hoisted up in the air until you died or you confessed, usually after your arms had been popped out of their sockets. Many people confessed, they just wanted it to stop. This is the boot. So your leg will be inserted into this boot-shaped contraption, and then this crank would be turned, tightening it bit by bit until your bones were shattered. That is the Black Virgin, also known as Iron Maiden. It was basically a coffin with spikes on the insides. It was mostly used in Germany. That's the wheel, basically being roasted alive. How much of this would you take before you confess and made up any story you wanted? So there were countless ways to force confessions, numberless ways that women were tortured. The tortures in England were the least horrid, and the victims died by hanging, not by burning. England was not a Catholic country, and therefore the methods were different from those used in Catholic countries, but didn't make it any less awful what happened to the women there. So, what are some of the questions that went along with the torture? They asked you, why did you become a witch? How did you become a witch? And what happened on the occasion? What demon did you choose to become your lover? What was his name? What was the name of your master among the evil demons? What oath were you forced to render to him? Where did you consummate your union with your incubus? What demons and other humans participated in the Sabbath? Who were your accomplices in evil? Who have you cast a spell on? How do you fly through the air? And what ointment do you rub on your broomstick? So now we're going to examine a few case histories of the women who were targeted. So everyone was targeted, everybody, rich, poor, young, and old, except for the upper classes. Sometimes it was older, middle-aged women. Sometimes it was disabled or outcast women. The rationale was that they were filled with malice over their lost youth or over their disability, and therefore they were witches. Other times it was younger women, particularly very attractive ones, who had rejected a man's advances. The rationale for this was that a beautiful woman could be Satan's tool to lure and destroy a man's soul. So Franz Bormann, a notorious judge in witch trials in Germany, in 1631, he had been rejected by the sister of a woman named Frau Peller, and so he accused Frau Peller of witchcraft. Before her trial, she was stripped to have her body examined for witch marks, and after that, she was raped by court officials. In Wurzburg City, hundreds of men, women, and children of exceptional beauty were killed off. Another set of women targeted were widows because they had no one to protect them. Also, midwives were accused, and so were women who had lost a child. So imagine that you were grieving the loss of your child, or you just had a miscarriage, and then you get accused of killing that child. Then also wealthy, well-known, and educated women were targeted, like Rebecca Lemp, a very wealthy, educated mother of 6 who was arrested in Germany while her husband was away on business. Her letters to her family from jail were just heartbreaking to read. So at first, she wrote her husband telling him that she's not going to confess no matter what they do. But they broke her with the torture, so she confessed. And then she made up nonsense about how she was a witch and she named others. She was burned along with 4 other women. And one of the saddest things about these witch hunts to me is that many times the accusers were also women. How a woman could do that to another woman, knowing how it was going to end, is just heartbreaking to me. And then, of course, there's also the story of Agnes Bernard. She was a lovely 17 or 18-year-old girl when she met the son of the Bavarian Duke, Albert III, in Augsburg. It was February 1428. So Agnes worked at a bathhouse as a bathing maid, and as soon as Albert saw her, he fell madly in love with her instantly. And soon they were a couple. They even had a daughter together within the first year of their time together. She became an established member of court in Munich. But Albert's dad expected his son to marry a high-born woman, and he kept on insisting that he marry someone else so that he could inherit the family wealth and the political clout of the family. Albert refused. Well, one day while Albert was out on a hunt that had been organized by one of his relatives, his dad had Agnes arrested for witchcraft and demanded a hasty trial. And so she was thrown from a bridge into the Danube River. And even though she was tied up and in her heavy dress, she managed to swim to shore. And with her hoarse voice, she was screaming for help. And then the man who had thrown her from the bridge rushed down to the riverbank. He wrapped the pole around her hair and plunged her head back underwater until she died. In Finland and in Iceland, more men than women were executed for witchcraft. And in France, it was about half and half. Half of those executed for witchcraft were men, but these were the exceptions. Then, not all accused were killed. A very notable one from Renaissance Italy was Veronica Franco. She was a famous author, a poet, and a courtesan. She only survived the Venetian Inquisition thanks to her power, her influence, and her powerful male allies. But even though she survived, after her acquittal, she never recovered her prior status, and she died poor with her reputation in tatters. Now let's talk about how it moved to England. So King James I had just married his new queen, Anne of Denmark. That's King James of England, of Scotland, sorry. And so they got married by proxy. And she set sail across the North Sea so she could join him and be crowned Queen of Scotland. It was the year 1589. She couldn't get to Scotland as there had been a turbulent storm at sea. The other ships even sank, but hers was only battered, and so they turned back, went back to Denmark. And so King James decided that he would go and get her himself. He went to Copenhagen in January 1590, when witch hysteria was gripping mainland Europe. And all thanks to the Malleus Malificarum, a stupid book. So while he was in Kronborg Castle, two witches were arrested in Copenhagen. After being tortured, they confessed that they had caused that violent storm at sea that prevented his queen from reaching Scotland. They also said that they had attempted to murder the Scottish king and queen because Satan wanted them dead. And so they, along with 5 other women, were burned at stake for it. And so James, he got his wife, he got back to Scotland and forgot all about the incident until the deputy bailiff of Trenant, a man named David Seaton, who lived 9 miles east of Edinburgh, brought it back to the fore. And so he claimed that his maid had suddenly acquired healing powers and was often sneaking out of the house at night. He tortured her with thumbscrews and she didn't confess. Next, he tried crushing her skull. In reality, the poor girl was just dating a man nearby. And so he searched her body and he found a hickey or love bite on her body. And at that time, it just wasn't done. You weren't allowed to have premarital sex. And she thought she was going to get in trouble for that. And so she confessed that she was a witch. But they tortured her, even though she confessed, they tortured her even more and made her name names. And so she named other witches in her coven. She named eight women, and they in turn were tortured and made to name others. And on and on and on it went until a total of 100 people were hunted and tortured. They said that they had worked in cahoots with the Copenhagen witches, and the repercussions of this would last 100 years. It was seismic. Saying that they had worked in league with the Danish witches got the king's full attention. He got directly involved in the case. He even interrogated some of the witches accused directly. Their confessions were beaten out of them. He knew this. He saw through it and he didn't believe them, which is why he wanted to question them directly. But one of the women repeated a bit of pillow talk he had had with his new wife to him, and that was what convinced him. But actually, in the 16th century, a king had very little privacy. Even in his bedchamber, there was often an attendant nearby so they could hear whatever was being said. And so such things were not private and they were widely gossiped about by their servants and they spread through to the common folk. But the poor woman just wanted the torture to end and she hoped to get executed soon. So it worked. And so all the women were garroted to death and then their bodies were burned. This is known as the North Berwick Witch Trials, and it was just the beginning. And it had the stamp of royal approval. You know, all this time, England was still not a part of the witchcraft hysteria. But in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and her cousin claimed the throne. And her cousin was none other than James, King of Scotland. And so he brought the terror to England. The English had had high hopes for him. He was foreign to them, and they wanted to know their new ruler. And so he published a book titled Demonology, in which he wrote that witches were real and they deserved to be punished. And if you didn't believe it, you were either an idiot or you were a fellow witch. And soon enough, accusations began to fly all over England. Fake ones, you know, it was just vendettas, taking revenge on your enemies. And in England, it started with the Pendle witch trials, where a little girl claimed that she had um, cursed a peddler. It was a little girl named Alison. She came from a family of female healers. And so one day, whilst working on the farm, she saw a peddler who was walking towards the town. And she asked if she could look through his goods, and he refused to let her. And so she claims that she cursed him, and the man immediately dropped down and had a heart attack. And she felt so guilty that she denounced herself as a witch. And so she embellished her story. And soon she roped in her grandmother, her mother, her neighbors, and a few others. They were all taken to a dungeon and interrogated. Her entire family got implicated, and they were all wiped out by hanging. And so the Pendle witch trials took the witch hunts mainstream in England. And then this one is an execution for heresy, i.e., being a Protestant in Queen Mary's England. I'm only including this one to illustrate just how ruthless the church was in dealing with people who they were opposed to, whether it was a heretic or whether they thought you were a witch. So it was July 1556 in Guernsey. A mother and her two daughters were taken to court on suspicion of theft. They were innocent, by the way. So, whilst taking their statements, it was discovered that they were not Catholic. And so they were set to get burnt on July 18th, 1556. And mind you, one of these women, one of the daughters, she was heavily pregnant, like almost 9 months, maybe 8.5 months pregnant. And in England, sometimes the women were strangled first so that their burning was more of a cremation. But in this instance, the rope that they were to be strangled with was broken. It broke. And apparently, there were no ropes left in all of England. And so these women were tied to the stake alive and aware, fully aware, when the fire was set. And so one of the daughters, Petrine, the heavily pregnant one, she gave birth in the flames to a baby boy. She gave birth in that fire. I mean, I've never been pregnant, but I hear it's not the most comfortable thing. And child labor is painful. And add that to a fire, you give birth to a baby boy in that fire. And then after she gave birth to the boy, I can't even say it. Use your imagination. It was a difficult one to research. And then let's go to another one. This one was in Ukraine in 1728. This one is about cows. At the time, a milk cow was the most prized commodity a family could own. It was a symbol of their well-being. And so naturally, there were fears that a witch's jealousy could cause someone else's cow to stop producing milk. For this reason, there were several types of prophylactic rituals and unwitching ceremonies to reverse such curses. And so a woman named Malanka borrowed a pot from her neighbor Agnieszka, and she returned a different pot. And then when Agnieszka tried to use said pot, her cow stopped producing milk. So Agnieszka returned to Malanka in tears, begging for her original pot back. But Malanka said she had sold it along with some butter. And then Agnieszka's cow was dry for a whole year. And so she thought it was witchcraft. She asked the neighbors for advice on what to do. And the solution was that she was supposed to put milk on a piece of bread and feed it to her cow, and also smear cow dung on her cow's horns and thighs. She did so, and voila, her cow started producing milk again. And so she said that Malanka was a witch. So Malanka also counter accused Agnieszka of bewitching her cow because apparently, after using Agnieszka's pot and then selling it, Malanka's cow began to produce foul smelling milk, and her cow also gave birth to a calf with a cat's body. Thankfully, this is one of the more benign ones. And so the magistrate said that the case was frivolous, but they made both women publicly swear that they were not witches, and they made Agnieszka pay a small fine for her ritual of smearing the cow with poop. So some women didn't even live long enough to make it to trial because they refused to confess despite the torture, and so they were tortured to death. And it was also common to find women raped and strangled in their jail cells. And the explanation would be that Satan had come and gotten his agent. Another common way that women who had been condemned were killed was to tie them up in a sack along with their cats and to throw them into a river. And many men died trying to protect their wives, their daughters, their sisters, and their mothers. But some men joined in to accuse their wives if they wanted to treat her or just didn't like their wife anymore. They joined in with the accusers. Or if they wanted to eliminate a pregnant mistress, they could just accuse her of being a witch and eliminate the problem. And so, what effect do you think these public spectacles of terror had on women psychologically? Women learned to be docile. There was collective discipline. Be silent, stay in your place, be submissive. In Marchienne, France, in 1679, a woman named Peroni Gauguelon managed to escape being raped by four drunk soldiers. These men then made her promise to pay them to leave her in peace. So this happened on the 8th of May. Her husband reported this to the authorities the next day, the 9th of May, and the very next day, she was declared to be a witch. So she was tortured until she confessed. And then she named her daughter and her cousin as her accomplices. They burned her on May 29th. And the last witch killed in Europe is a woman named Anna Goldi. It happened in 1782 in Switzerland. So Anna was born and raised in the region of Saxe. She came from extreme poverty. She started working as a maid in her teens. She had a baby when she was 31 years old, but the baby did not survive the night. And so she was blamed for her child's death. She was pilloried and then placed under house arrest for 6 years. After 6 years, she escaped and walked an entire day to another canton, the Glarus canton. She got a job working for a wealthy family. And while working there, she got involved with her employer's son, and they even had a baby boy together. But due to the wide gulf in their social classes, they could not marry. And so she left and got a job working for a judge and a doctor named Jacob Schutte, a member of the Glarus elite. One morning, her employer's daughter found needles in her milk, and Anna was blamed for it and she was fired from her job. 2 weeks later, another of the Schutte family daughters began to throw up pins and other metallic objects. Anna wasn't even there anymore, but she was still blamed for it and she was arrested. She denied any involvement and the accusations of witchcraft, but she was tortured until she confessed. After all, he was a powerful man, and so his friends were made jurors on the case. In fact, the jury was comprised almost exclusively of his friends, and so of course Anna was condemned, and she was subsequently decapitated with a sword. And strangely, after her execution, Jacob requested an official document that stated basically, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And it's odd because no one had accused him. And so it's highly likely that they had an affair and he set her up to avoid being exposed, or he had molested her or something, and he set her up so that he could maintain his reputation. So Switzerland exonerated her in 2008, and there's a museum that was built in her honor in Switzerland. Then the last woman burned in Europe may or may not have been burned for witchcraft. Her name was Barbara Zdunk. It happened in 1811 in Poland. So ethnically, Barbara was a Slavic woman. She was a maid working in the city of Wrocław in Poland. And she was apparently quite knowledgeable about magic and plants. Barbara had fallen in love with a younger man, but he didn't feel the same way about her. And so in 1806, when a fire razed the granaries on the 17th of September, Barbara was made the scapegoat. And this fire burned down all the greens and almost wiped out the entire city. And so she was arrested on the grounds that she had caused the fire to punish the world because that guy had rejected her. In actuality, it's suspected that the fire was set by Polish soldiers of Napoleon's army, but it's still speculation. Everybody knew that she was innocent. Nevertheless, she was locked up in a dungeon at the Wrocław castle, where she was tortured and repeatedly raped for 3 years. Due to lack of evidence, the court officials were reluctant to sentence her. They knew she didn't do it. And so her sentence was left to the discretion of King Friedrich William III of Prussia. And he ultimately decided that she should be sent to her death. And so the sentence was carried out on August 21st, 1811. And so she was suffocated to death and then subsequently burned at stake. So now let's touch upon what happened in Salem, the Salem witch trials. Let me set the stage. European immigrants, many of whom were Puritans from England, had settled in Salem, a port city in Massachusetts. The year was 1692, and that January was bitterly cold with high winds whistling through the cracks in the walls of the homes. At the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, each night all the water inside the house will turn into solid blocks of ice. He was the Puritan minister for the village, but he was very unhappy. Why? The church was meant to have provided him with firewood, but he failed to deliver. And so he and his family were literally freezing. A church committee comprised of wealthy merchants had voted against paying him the money he was expecting. And so he was broke and he was enraged. But the most troubling thing on his mind that winter was that something was terribly wrong with his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and with his 11-year-old niece, Abigail. Both girls were twitching violently, choking, and having body contortions into abnormal shapes and positions. So there were 8 people in his household, and this included 2 slaves, Tituba and John. Both were First Nations, Native American. So he could barely feed them all. And then this homeless woman named Sarah, who was a chain smoker, came begging for food. They gave her a bit of what they had, and rather than thank them, she muttered something under her breath. And at the time, smoking was, something the church just didn't condone. And then soon after the Sarah woman left, his niece and daughter started to get progressively worse. He prayed, he fasted, he gave them all sorts of elixirs. Nothing changed. And so he summoned the village doctor, a man named William Griggs. And his medical opinion was that both girls were under an evil hand. That is, they were bewitched. This sort of thing had happened before in the 1640s when European settlers and their farm animals would experience violent convulsions. Doctors couldn't find any rational explanations for it. And those affected also complained of getting pinched, choked, bitten, scratched, sat upon, and also of experiencing temporary paralysis. And so before long, an explanation emerged, which is the devil's witches were responsible, but they weren't alone. They had their fluffy, furry, four-legged little helpers too. In fact, in the 1640s, new laws in Connecticut and Massachusetts proclaimed that witchcraft was a crime punishable by death. And so anyone could accuse anyone of witchcraft. And of course, their true motives were usually envy or spite. Nevertheless, the consequences were deadly. All this to say, the doctor's diagnosis for the Paris girls wasn't out of the ordinary. And so Reverend Paris and his wife rode off to a lecture in a nearby town. And while they were gone, the slaves, Tituba and John, decided to try and help the girls. They knew of a way to draw out witches using folk magic. And they got the recipe for a witch cake. It sounds really yummy too. Just listen to this. First, you boil snippets of the girl's hair, and then you mix in rye flour, and then you mix in urine from both girls. And after you mix the urine, you bake it in the fireplace. And now, after baking this yummy cake, all they needed to do was feed it to a dog or a cat, because they were typically the familiars of witches, right? And the idea was that once they ate the cake, the spell would be broken and the girls would be free and able to reveal the name of the witch tormenting them. Unfortunately, the Reverend and his wife found out about the witch cake and they were furious. How dare you practice black magic in this house? And so they continue to uh, pray for the girls, and the girls seem to get progressively worse. No amount of prayers helped. Finally, the reverends and other people pressed the girls to reveal who the witches tormenting them were. And the girls, Betty and Abigail, said that it was Tituba, the slave girl who had cared for them from infancy. They also accused Sarah. Remember the homeless woman who had come begging, the smoker? They roped her in. They also accused a bedridden woman who was having a dispute over land with one of the members of the church committee. Her name was Sarah Osborne. Tituba, the enslaved girl, pleaded with them, saying she loved those girls. She could never hurt them. It didn't matter. So all three women were arrested. On March 1st, massive crowds from all the surrounding towns came down to Salem for the start of the proceedings. So first they would be questioned, and then they would appear before a grand jury, and then they would have a trial. So their bodies were examined for any birthmarks, warts, or bumps. There were no marks found. Then the two magistrates started interrogating the women. Each was brought in separately. And it didn't help matters that their accusers were present in the courtroom, twitching, tumbling on the floor, and screaming about how spirits of the accused were swooping down on them and torturing them. And these women, they were already condemned. This was just a formality. No matter how much they denied any involvement, the magistrates and the girls just kept on accusing. And so Tituba denied any involvement at first, but she eventually declared that she was guilty, and the other two women were her sister witches because Reverend Paris had given her a talking to. And by talking to, I mean he'd beaten her senseless and told her, ordered her to confess, and she obeyed him. And so all three women were condemned and remanded to prison. Sarah Osborne succumbed to her illness and she died in jail. Sarah, the homeless woman, was executed by hanging. Tituba was eventually set free because she had confessed, but she didn't get out of prison immediately because back then the accused would be kept in a dark, rat-infested dungeon, shackled to the walls with heavy chains. And in those days, you had to pay for your shackles and for many other fees. You paid your jailers who tortured you many other fees. Otherwise, you'll never get your freedom. And so, even though she was um, not condemned to death, she remained in prison until she paid all the fees. And so, this was just the beginning. Word of this spread around, and so more and more people were accused. Many of them confessed, just like Tituba, to save themselves from the hangman's noose. And I suppose you're wondering if Abigail and Betty stopped having the contortions after um, the conviction and the execution. No, they did not. They continued to have the contortions and the spasms. But now there was mass hysteria and panic in Salem. No human, cat, or dog was safe. People kept on claiming that they were seeing evil spirits and naked witches and birds everywhere. 3 more witches were singled out, including a 4-year-old girl, the daughter of the now dead homeless woman. A 4-year-old girl. One woman was singled out because she was a mother to a mixed race boy. And she had mentioned how she thought all these accusations of witchcraft were just absolute rubbish. And for that reason, she was accused. And so she and her 80-year-old husband were executed. And many of those conducting the trials were relatives of the accused, or of the accusers, sorry. And one of the cardinal rules in natural justice, it comes from a Latin maxim, nemo judex in causa sua, which means you cannot be a judge in your own cause. No one should be a judge in their own case, right? Or no one should be a judge in a case where they have a vested interest. Well, that maxim went out of the window. And within 1 year, there were over 100 accusations and 20 further executions. And it wasn't until the governor's wife was accused of being a witch that it stopped. Because after his wife was accused, he suspended all the trials and he stopped all the executions. How convenient. So, the witch is shorthand for a woman's power and potential and for the perceived threat that these things pose. So, the witch trials were about power, about terror, and unbridled misogyny. And any men who attempted to defend any of these women faced the same fate because they were collateral damage at a thing that was disproportionately aimed at women. So, how did it all end? It didn't. The methods have changed and it's more subtle. In any English speaking country today, if a man gets angry at a woman and insults her, what is usually the first thing he calls her? A bitch. It's funny how it sounds like witch. To this day, women are told what to wear in many countries in this world. Look what happened to that poor girl in Iran recently. She had hair out of place and it cost her her life. How many children does Elon Musk have from multiple women? If a woman did that today, what would we call her? Call her a slut. How many names like this do we have for men? Yes, you can call him a womanizer or maybe a male harlot. What else? Look at all the derogatory names that we have for women. If a woman is accomplished in her career, then she slept her way to the top. She elevates herself to becoming a musician or an actress. Oh, it's Illuminati. She has the audacity to run for president. A cult called QAnon is formed, and there's stories about how she drinks the blood of babies along with her Satan worshipping cabal of pedophiles. Show me any religion on earth where women wield any real power. I'll wait. There isn't one. And please don't see Queen Elizabeth II with the Church of England. She didn't wield any real power there. It was symbolic and hereditary. Is there any country on earth where women tell men how to dress? Women in America recently lost their right to have abortions, even if it was the result of a rape, even if it was incest, even if it was to save the woman's life. Is there any country where women have taken away men's rights to vasectomies? So the witch trials were successful. And we have even internalized everything because even today, women join in oppressing other women, which makes it even worse because we join in our own oppression. I mean, I admit I don't know that much about US politics, but I don't remember any other past candidates for president that was threatened with prison or received the level of hate that Hillary Clinton received, or that had a cult um, formed to tarnish her reputation. Anyway, it was a interesting but also sad topic to research. But I hope you found it interesting. See you at the next one. Ciao.